Boris Groys is a philosopher, essayist, art critic, media theorist, and an internationally acclaimed expert on late Soviet postmodern art and literature, as well as on the Russian avant-garde. His writing engages the wildly disparate traditions of French post-structuralism and modern Russian philosophy. In the 1970s, Dr. Groys, who had studied philosophy and mathematics at Leningrad State University, immersed himself in the unofficial cultural scene in Russia's capitals, coining the term Moscow conceptualism. His book, The Total Art of Stalinism, had a tremendous influence on thinking about late Soviet Russian art. Recent books in English include Medium Religion with Peter Weibel, The Communist Postscript, and Art Power. Since 1994, he has served as the curator and organizer of numerous international art exhibitions and conferences, and been a professor of aesthetics, art history, and media theory at the Center for Art and Media Technology in Karlsruhe, and is currently Global Distinguished Professor of Russian and Slavic Studies at NYU. In his book-length essay on Ilya Kabakhov's early installation, The Man Who Flew into Space from His Apartment, Groys wrote, "The Soviet Union was itself just a gigantic art installation, for its reality was shaped according to purely ideological, if you like, artistic criteria, and people neither wanted nor were able to distinguish at all clearly between reality and imagination." Tonight he's going to talk about how contemporary art has become a mass cultural practice, and how Joseph Beuys's famous maxim, "Everybody is an artist," is no longer a prediction of a utopian future, but rather an accurate description of the status quo. Please welcome Boris Groys.
What I will present you is not so much, or maybe partially, but not so much actually related to my Russian or German past or American present, but to the kind of involvement in different educational programs that try to teach artists, to teach art to the artist. So to produce not the artworks, but the artist. And that is, of course, an interesting experience for me. I also taught for a very long time at the art school, I must say. But it seems to me that in the last recent years, the question of art education, the question of what kind of knowledge art can be, and what is the relationship of this knowledge to the general texture of contemporary democratic societies, it seems to me that it became a very interesting field of discussions. And so what I will try to say is a kind of reaction to these discussions I was involved in, and maybe in a certain way preliminary reactions, because I'm just beginning to be involved more than before in this kind of reflections. So that is kind of my first reaction after some time of participating in these discussions. So in our times, we know that everything can be an artwork, or rather everything can be turned into an artwork by an artist. There is no possibility for a spectator to distinguish between artwork and the simple thing on the basis of the spectator's visual experience alone. The spectator must know that a particular object is used by an artist in the context of his or her artistic practice to be able to identify this object as an artwork or as a part of an artwork. But who is an artist? And how the artist can be distinguished from a non-artist, if such a differentiation is possible at all. Meanwhile, we have a long tradition of institutional critique. During the last few decades, the role of collectors, curators, trustees, museum directors, gallerists, art critics, etc., has been extensively analyzed and criticized by mostly artists. But what about the artists themselves? The contemporary artist is obviously also an institutional figure. And contemporary artists are mostly ready to accept the fact that the critique of art institutions is a critique from within. Thus, it seems that today the artist is defined simply as a professional, fulfilling a certain role in a general framework of the art world that is based, as any other bureaucratic organization or capitalist corporation, on the division of labor. And one can also argue that part of this role is to criticize the art world with a goal to make it more open, more inclusive, better informed, and because of that, maybe also more efficient and more profitable. The answer is certainly plausible, but at the same time, not really persuasive. Let us remember the well-known maxim formulated by Joseph Beuys: everybody is an artist. This maxim has a long tradition going back to early Marxism and Russian avant-garde, and therefore is almost always characterized today, and was already characterized at Beuys' time, as being utopian. Namely, this maxim is understood as an expression of a utopian hope that in the future, the mankind that currently consists predominantly of non-artists becomes a mankind consisting of artists. But I would never say that it is utopian if the figure of artist is defined as it was just defined. A vision of the world that is completely turned into the art world, and in which every human being has to produce artworks and compete for the chance to exhibit them at this or that biennial, so to be professional artist in already defined sense, is by no means a utopian vision. Rather, it is a highly dystopian vision, in fact, a complete nightmare. Now, it can be said, and indeed it was often said, that Beuys had a romantic utopian understanding also of figure role of the artist. And it is also often said that this romantic utopian vision is passé. But this diagnosis also does not seem to me to be very persuasive. The tradition in which our contemporary art world functions, including our current art institutions, was formed after the Second World War. This tradition is based on the art practices of the historical avant-garde and their updating and codification during the 1950s and 60s. Now, one does not have an impression that this tradition changed a lot since that time. On the contrary, through time, it became more and more solidified. The new generations of professional artists find their access to the art system predominantly through the network of art schools and educational programs that have become increasingly globalized during recent decades. This globalized and pretty uniform art education is based on the same avant-garde canon that dominates other contemporary art institutions, and that includes, of course, not only avant-garde art production itself, but also the art that was made later in the avant-garde tradition. The dominant mode of a contemporary art production is the academicized late avant-garde art. That is why it seems to me that to be able to answer who is an artist, one should first at all turn back to the beginnings of the historical avant-garde, to the role of the artist as it was defined at that time, and to look at what happened to this role, how this role was transformed, if at all. All art education, as any education in general, has to be based on certain types of knowledge or a certain mastery that is supposed to be transmitted from one generation to another. Thus the question arises, what kind of knowledge and mastery is transmitted by the contemporary art schools? This question, as we all know, produces a lot of confusion in contemporary minds. The role of the pre-avant-garde art academies was well enough defined. There, we had to do with a well-established criteria of technical mastery in painting, sculpture, and other media that could be taught to the art students. Today, the art schools partially return to this understanding of art education, especially in the field of new media, because new media need some specific technical skills. But of course, art cannot be reduced to the sum of technical skills of whatever art. That is why today we see the emergence of the discourse on art as a form of knowledge, a discourse that becomes unavoidable when art becomes to be taught. Now, the claim that art is a form of knowledge is by no means new. Religious art had a claim to present the religious truth in a visual pictorial form to a spectator who could not contemplate them directly. And traditional mimetic art pretended to reveal the natural, everyday world in a way in which the common spectator could not see it. Both of these claims were criticized by many authors, from Plato to Hegel. And both of these claims were endorsed by other authors, from Aristotle to Heidegger. But whatever one can say about the corresponding philosophical pros and cons, both of these claims about art being a specific form of knowledge were explicitly rejected by the historical avant-garde, together with the traditional criteria of mastery connected to these claims. Through the avant-garde, the profession of the artist became deprofessionalized. The deprofessionalization of art has put the artist in a pretty awkward situation because this deprofessionalization is often interpreted by public as a return of the artist to the status of non-professionalism. Accordingly, the contemporary artist begins to be perceived as a professional non-professional, and the art world and the art practice as a kind of art conspiracy, to use a Baudrillard term. The social effectiveness of this conspiracy seems to present a mystery that can be deciphered only sociologically. Bourdieu is a good example of this kind of approach. And I was participating recently in some conferences where almost half of speakers stated that contemporary art, being not anymore any profession, any mastery, can be described only in sociological terms, as a kind of specific sociological strange, mysterious phenomenon. So not from the inside, but only from the outside. However, the deprofessionalization of art undertaken by the avant-garde should not be misunderstood as a simple return to non-professionality. Deprofessionalization of art is an artistic operation that transforms art practice in general, rather than merely bringing an individual artist to the original state of non-professionality. And more than that, this operation cannot be completely and definitively realized, but must be repeated time and again, as I will show. Thus, the deprofessionalization of art is in itself a highly professional operation. So my first thesis is that deprofessionalization is the effect of professional activity of an artist and is in itself a profession. Later, I will discuss the relationship between deprofessionalization as professional practice of the artist and democratization of art. But at the moment, I would like to discuss knowledge and mastery that are needed to effectively practice this profession, so that is needed to deprofessionalize art. In his recent book, The Time That Remains, Georgia Agamben describes, using the example of St. Paul, the knowledge and mastery that is required to become a professional apostle. This knowledge is messianic knowledge, knowledge that the coming end of the world as we know it, of contracting time, of the scarcity of time in which we live. The scarcity of time that annuls every profession, because the practicing of every profession needs a perspective of long durée, needs the duration of time, stability of the world as it is. In the sense, the profession of the apostle is, as Agamben writes, to practice the revocation of all the vocations. One can also say deprofessionalization of all the professions. The contracting time impoverishes, empties all our cultural science and activities, turning them into zero science, or rather, as Agamben says, weak science. Such weak science are the signs of the coming end of time being weakened by this coming, already manifesting the lack of time that is needed to produce and to contemplate strong, rich science. However, at the end of time, this messianic weak science triumph over the strong science of our world, strong science of authority, tradition, and power, but also over the strong science of revolt, heroism, or shock. Speaking about the weak science of the messianic, Agamben obviously has in mind weak messianism, a term introduced by Walter Benjamin. But one can also remember, even if Agamben doesn't do that, the term kenosis that in the tradition of Greek theology characterized the figure of Christ. The life, suffering, and death of Christ being a humiliation of human dignity and emptying of the science of divine glory. The figure of Christ is in this sense also a weak sign that can be easily misunderstood as a sign of weakness, a point that was later extensively discussed by Nietzsche in his Antichrist, and Agamben also refers to that. Now I would suggest that the avant-garde artist is a secularized apostle in this Agamben sense, a messenger of time that brings to the world the message that time is contracting, that there's no more time, or there's a scarcity of time, maybe even lack of time. Modernity is indeed a time of permanent loss of the familiar world and of traditional condition of living. It is a time of permanent change, historical breaks, new ends, and new beginnings. Living within modernity means to have no time, to experience a permanent scarcity, lack of time, because modern projects are mostly abandoned without being realized. Every new generation develops its own projects, its own techniques, and its own professions for the realization of these projects that become again abandoned by the following generation. In this sense, our present time is not a postmodern, but rather an ultramodern time, because it is a time where scarcity of time, lack of time, became increasingly more obvious and ubiquitous. We know it's today, everybody is busy, nobody has time. We know that nobody has time, but I think we tend to think that nobody has time means that this concrete person has no time. But if we remember Heidegger's Being and Time and other books on this topic, then we begin to understand that specific person, and we all do not have time, simply because there is no time. So the time of modernity, we saw all our traditions and inherited lifestyles being condemned to decline and disappearance. But today, we do not even trust in the longevity of our present actual fashions, lifestyles, and ways of thinking. In fact, already at the moment of the emergence of these new trends and fashions, we immediately begin to imagine the unavoidable disappearance that we anticipate to come rather sooner than later. Indeed, when a new trend emerges, the first thought that comes to one's mind is how long it would last. And the answer is always not so long. One can say that not only modernity, but even to much degree our own time became chronically messianic or chronically apocalyptic. The avant-garde is often associated with the notion of progress. I think it's a gravest mistake in relationship to understanding of avant-garde, especially technological progress. Indeed, one can find many statements of the avant-garde artists and theorists that are directed against the conservatives and insist on the futility of practicing old forms of art under the new conditions that are determined by the new technology. But this new technology was interpreted, at least by the first generation of the avant-garde artists, not as a chance to build a new stable world, but as a machine of destruction of the old world, and also of the permanent self-destruction of the modern technological civilization itself. The forces of progress were perceived by the avant-garde artists of the early generation mostly as destructive forces. Thus, the avant-garde asked the following question: how to make art that would escape the permanent change? Art that would be atemporal or transtemporal. The avant-garde art did not want to create art of the future. It wanted to create trans-temporal art for all the times. Time and again, one hears and reads that we need change. Yes, we hear that we need change. That our goal, also our goal in art, should be to change the status quo. But the change is our status quo. The permanent change is our only reality. We are living in a prison of the permanent change. To change the status quo, we have to change the change, to escape from the change. In fact, every utopia is nothing else. Yeah? Every ever described utopia is an escape from the change, from Thomas Morris on. When Agamben describes the annulment of occupation and the emptying of cultural science, he thinks about, like St. Paul, about our souls that are saved for the new world, new era. But of course, radical avant-garde was not very much interested in souls. It was interested in art. The question was not how to save the souls. The question was how to save the art. Now, when Kandinsky, for example, speaks about the reduction of all painterly mimesis, all representation of the world, the reduction that reveals that all paintings are actually combinations of color and shapes, he wants to guarantee the survival of his vision of painting through all possible future cultural transformations, including even the most revolutionary transformations. So if one reads his text, one immediately recognizes that what he actually wants to make is not his own abstract art. He wants to give it a clue, a kind of didactic material that would allow us to see every painting and even every image ever produced, or every image that can be produced in the future, as pure combination of shapes and colors. So whatever any image empirically is, it is or must be, as Kandinsky thinks, also basically, if it is reduced, a pure combination of colors and shapes. So if you see every image as a pure combination of colors or shapes, then you acquire some kind of gaze, a perspective, under which all the images are identical. So you have a kind of pattern of repetition underlying all the processes of historical change. So that at a certain level, everything changed, but at a certain level, everything becomes and remains identical and repetitive. So in this way, we create a certain image that can transcend every time border. And it can transcend every time border of the future, but also time border of the past. And not only in terms of painting, but also in every other term. So, for example, every photograph and every video and every film and so on can be also seen, can be also interpreted as a combination of shapes and colors. And with Malevich, of course, as we all know, we have even more radical reduction to the black square. And black square can be seen as a transcendental image. So as an image that is repetitive through every possibility of image production and contemplation, and precisely through the repetition of the black square, we see everything that we see. So whatever image we see, this image is a black square. We cannot see anything without seeing black square at the same time. That is actually what Malevich had in mind, precisely like Duchamp, who actually thought that whatever we show in an exhibition, whatever we exhibit, is a ready-made that can be also painting or whatever else. But there is an underlying transcendental gesture of showing things that is stable through the times and historical changes. So it seems to me that the true goal of the avant-garde should not be seen in innovation, originality, but in the creation of weak, transcendental, reduced images by the means of reduction, weak images that precisely because of their weakness were supposed to transcend the technological and political transformations of modernity and manifest the repetitive pattern that underlies these transformations. The avant-garde is non-original because it did not want to invent. It wanted to discover the transcendental repetitive images. But of course, every such discovery of the unoriginal was understood as an original discovery, as it is also in science or philosophy. And that's why avant-garde artists believed that their discoveries of transcendental repetitive patterns underlying the historical change are kind of final ones, that they kind of found once and for all times this kind of repetitive pattern, and in this way they open this transhistorical dimension of the culture. But of course what happened is that the avant-garde transcendental images were put and shown in the same spaces, in the same exhibition spaces as any other images. So if we create this kind of weak transcendental science, and they put them on the same wall on which the other traditional painting is already shown, then the transcendental images lose in our imagination and our perception their transcendental level. They begin to look like every other image. That's simply a style, simply a historical manifestation of certain historical period. So what actually happened is that avant-garde created a clearing of the situation and confusion at the same time. It was a clearing because avant-garde found this kind of absolute weak transcendental science and has shown this science. At the same time, it created a confusion because these science were shown as historical manifestation of certain time in a general context of art historical art representation. Art historical art representation that is actually accessible and observable by any eyes, any democratic eyes, any public eyes, any profane eyes. I tell that because it was a radical innovation. If there was an innovation, it was that innovation. Because if you look at the whole tradition of transcendental religious thinking, it was never the case. The whole tradition of European culture, at least, but general traditional culture, presupposed some kind of hierarchy of gazes. A philosophical gaze, a philosophical imagination could perceive pure forms, transcendent forms, or religious forms underlying the world as it is seen by profane eyes. And also hierarchical order of the society was based fundamentally on the hierarchy of gazes. That is actually Plato, assumed that the philosopher can see transcendental images that the normal eye cannot see. And so the society should be built in a way that it will be governed by philosophers, by the people who have this kind of special intuition, special ability to see what other people cannot see. But at the moment that you make out of this geometrical, pure forms simply a painting, as Malevich did it actually, and Mondrian and many other avant-garde artists, and you show this painting in the same space as any other painting, you immediately democratize the vision. You erase and destroy the hierarchy of gazes, and that is precisely what avant-garde actually made. Avant-garde at the same time mobilized philosophical, religious, transcendental gaze and vision, and democratized it by bringing it in a democratically observable and accessible art exhibition space. So we have at the same time a certain clearing and confusion. And actually what I want to say is that this confusion that was produced avant-garde needs another avant-garde that kind of clears this confusion and creates new confusion. And this new confusion needs a new reduction that creates new clearing, new clarification, but also new confusion. So what we have today, and I think that is contemporary condition, that's our contemporary condition, is a kind of a repetitiveness of repetition. Yeah? We create all the time new and new reductions, simplification, and clarifications, new and new weak science, to stabilize this kind of level of generalization, level of universalism, level of democracy, level of transcendental weakness, that kind of underlying historical change in which our civilization is involved. But this act cannot be fulfilled once and for all, but becomes repetitive, 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 in even repetitive, even faster and faster way. I show you, I have some examples of contemporary art that, as it seems to me, stays in this tradition of repetitive simplification and simplified repetitiveness, but I also do not have enough time to show all of them, so I show only one very short example of that, namely a short video by Francis Alice, made in 1998, I believe, under the title Song for Lupita. So maybe you can show that. Yeah, it's very good. Yeah. It's very good because it's precisely this kind of weak repetitive gesture that in my native Russian language can be described as, and is described as переливание из пустого в порожнее, if somebody speaks Russian here, so pouring emptiness into the void. Yeah. So what happens here is this kind of internal repetition that brings no result at all. And actually, I could also cite other artists that very well master this effect. For example, Artur Żmijewski and some other. But I think that Francis Alice is an interesting example of that because he shows this weak, repetitive gesture as something that is, on the one hand, impossible to include in every strategy of progress, because progress has to do with results, with products. Yeah? And actually what happens in the progress and economic growth and whatever people want to have is that the living time of work, living time of pure activity is erased. Progress is a huge machine of erasure of living time invested in a product, but by investing in the product, disappearing as a product, becoming non-usable, non-exploitable, and in a sense also being discarded. Actually, Francis Alice uses a metaphor also in different places. I like very much his work dedicated to the work of the shoe cleaner. Because, of course, shoe cleaner is somebody who makes a work without any product. You make a shoe clean and then it becomes dirty in the next minute. And Alice says that it is a work that actually undermines the Marxist notion of value as time accumulated in a product. So we have this kind of weak gesture. And what I actually would like to speak about at the end of my lecture, because it goes to the end, at the end of my time, is precisely these problems of the weak gesture. Because weak gesture is at the same time a repetitive and everyday gesture. In fact, avant-garde art is still not popular. So if I say that avant-garde art is paradigmatically the democratic art, then it can be misleading because a lot of people do not like the avant-garde art. It's not popular. And because it is not popular, people think that it is an elitist art because it reflects some kind of elitist taste. I think there is a huge confusion in this appreciation of the avant-garde tradition. The confusion is that the avant-garde art opened the way for a weak gesture, a weak image, conceived as an artwork. And because of all of the arts are practicing weak gestures, and we have low visibility, and we produce weak images, avant-garde art opens the democratic space. It's not a part of the democratic space, of course, but it opens it. It opens it in a way that I explain right now, in a way that everybody participating in the space can be seen as artist. And because it can be seen as artist, it is not a spectator. He's not a spectator, she's not a spectator. What does it mean to be popular? To be popular means to see all other people as spectators and to appeal to them as spectators. Of course, if we have a competition between avant-garde weak gesture and pop cultural strong gesture, then the strong gesture of pop culture wins. If both of them are understood as images as gesture directed toward the public, democratic public, as public consisting of spectators. But if we see the public as a public consisting of potential artists, so the people who are producing images and not consuming images, not consumers but producers, then of course pop culture images do not involve them in a creative space, and the avant-garde does. This repetitive and weak gesture, this wasted time of self-presentation with low visibility that is avant-garde, and Alisart has shown that, reduced almost on a zero level, opens a space that seems to me to be one of the most mysterious places of our contemporary democracy, namely social networks like Facebook, MySpace, YouTube, Second Life, and Twitter, that offer global populations the opportunity to play the photos, videos, and text in a way that cannot be distinguished from any other conceptualist or post-conceptualist artwork. In this sense, the space has been opened initially by radical neo-avant-garde conceptual art of the 60s and 70s. Without the artistic reductions, radical artistic reductions, that were effectuated by this artist, the emergence of the aesthetics of the social networks would be impossible. And they could not be open to the mass democratic public to the same degree as it actually is. And without this repetitive, weak gesture of self-presentation, the social networks would be also dysfunctional. They would be not working. They would be not functioning. These networks are characterized by the mass production and placement of weak signs that have low visibility, instead of mass contemplation of strong signs that have high visibility, as it was the case during the 20th century. What we are experiencing now is a dissolution of the mainstream mass culture, as it was described by many influential theoreticians as era of kitsch, Greenberg, cultural, industry Adorno, or societal spectacle, De Boer. This mass culture was created by the ruling political commercial elites for the masses of consumers, of spectators. Now the unified space of the mass culture is going through the process of fragmentation. We still have the stars, but they don't shine as bright as before. Today, everybody writes text and places images, but who has enough time to see and read them? Obviously nobody. Or it could be only a small circle of like-minded co-authors, acquaintances, and relatives. The traditional relationship between producers and spectators that was established by the mass culture during the 20th century has become completely reversed. Earlier, a chosen few, stars and celebrities, produced images and text for the millions of readers and spectators. Now millions of producers produce text and images for actually few spectators who has either scarce time or no time at all to read and see them. So instead of small group of images and gesture with extremely high visibility, that is a typical situation of the 20th century. We have a complete reversal. We have millions and millions of images, gesture, text with very low visibility and very weak content and aesthetics. As I told in discussions that was yesterday, I was impressed for the first time as I went to the internet, this was many years ago. I was very much impressed by a kind of group of sites under the general title, My Cat. Suddenly I saw thousands and thousands of websites describing one's cat, as cute, nice, and so on and so on. And interesting that it was absolutely no communication between these people. So maybe the internet was not developed at that time and so on. So no comments. But it was kind of soliloquy. It was kind of monologue about everybody was like a wilderness, a virtual wilderness, praising its own cat, the own cat. So that is a very strange phenomenon that really deeply impressed me. So during the classical period of mass culture, one was expected to compete for public attention. One was expected to invent an image and a text that would be so strong, surprising, and shocking that it could capture the attention of the masses, even if it happened only for a short span of time. Andy Warhol famously spoke in this context about 15 minutes of fame, even if he himself made several hours of sleep, which is a typical, of course, avant-garde gesture, because you have weak sign actually sleeping person doesn't want to be seen, yeah, and doesn't interested in be seen, so on and so on. It's interesting thing to discuss precisely in these terms. But of course, also the internet can become and partially becomes a space for strong images and text that begin to dominate it from time to time. That is why younger generation of artists are increasingly interested in weak visibility and weak public gestures. Everywhere we witness the emergence of artistic groups in which participants and spectators coincide. These groups make art for themselves and maybe for the artists of other groups if they are ready to collaborate. This kind of participation or practice means that one can become a spectator only when one already has become an artist. Otherwise, one simply would not be able to get an access to the corresponding art practices. Now let us come back to the beginning of this lecture. Avant-garde and contemporary art that stays in the tradition is an art that operates by reduction, producing in this way atemporal universalist weak images and gestures. And they are universalist because they are weak, not because they are strong. It is an art that has and represents a secular messianic knowledge that the world in which we live is a transitory world, subject to permanent change, and at the time when any strong image is necessarily short and makes it weak. And it is also an art of low visibility that can be compared to the low visibility of everyday life. And it is, of course, not accidental, because it is primarily our everyday life that survives through historical breaks and shifts, precisely because of this weakness and low visibility. In fact, today, the everyday life begins to demonstrate or communicate itself as such, through design and through contemporary participatory networks of communication, and it becomes impossible to differentiate anymore the presentation of the everyday life from the everyday itself. The everyday becomes a work of art. There is no more bare life, or rather bare life demonstrates itself as an artifact. Artistic activity is now something that the artist share with his or her public on the most common level of everyday experience, because everybody now makes design. Everybody now organizes his or her own apartment as an artistic installation. And everybody puts the science of his or her presence in the world in the same way in which contemporary art does it. Weak science. To be an artist has ceased to be an exclusive fate. Instead, it has become an everyday practice, a weak gesture. But to establish and to maintain this weak everyday level of art, one has to repeat permanently the artistic reduction, resisting strong images, escaping status quo that functions as a permanent exchange of the strong images and permanent exploitation of one's own time and one's own everyday existence for the goals of capitalist economical growth. At the beginning, for the progress, at the beginning of this lecture on aesthetics, Hegel asserted that art was already during his time a thing of the past. Hegel believes that in the time of modernity, art could no longer manifest anything true about the world as it is. But the avant-garde art has shown that art still has to say something about the modern world, that it can demonstrate its transitory character, its lack of time. So it's not about the world, but it's a time condition of its existence. And at the same time, to transcend this lack of time through a weak, minimal, transcendental gesture that needs a very short time or even no time at all. Thank you. One can bring many examples from different perspectives. In a certain way, 9/11 was a strong image as an image. Madonna wanted, or Michael Jackson created strong images in a different space. Military images, images produced by sports, images produced by pop culture, images produced by Hollywood, images that capture our imagination and are the reference points for the mass consciousness. In fact, if you speak to the people today and ask them about what kind of image all of them have in mind, then of course there are certain very small number of images that they saw in TV, that they saw in the media, and they have very different sources, but they are very few in number. And you always can be sure that you can, if you relate to someone, you will be understood. On the other hand, you have a very great number of these weak gestures I was speaking about. You don't know them. You don't know all these cats. You don't know all these things. Yeah. At the same time, what is very interesting is that you also will be generally understood if you begin to speak about how these kind of images are produced. Because everybody has produced them. They are different, but they are produced in almost the identical same way. We have a very interesting culture that functions very pluralistic on the level of content, but very uniform on the level of media and forms of productions. And so actually the production of weak images is almost identical or easily comparable, even if the images themselves are extremely heterogeneous. So if strong images are generally accessible and generally known in our civilization as such, weak images are known from the side of the production and distribution. So as artistic gesture, and not from the perspective of a spectator. So that's what the difference between contemporary art world and let's say what happens in the different space here in the cinema. So Harrison Ford is a strong image. Yeah? But I would argue that even Agamben is a weak one. What is about exhibition? If you go to the exhibition, it is presumed that you expect to see strong images, but you don't know, I don't believe that this expectation is really there. We have a part of the art world is competing with pop industry, with TV, with the sport, with other high-profile, strong industries for producing strong images. It is especially characteristic for London, yeah, and New British, Young British art, and so on and so on. That is actually a compensation for the media coverage more than for image production per se. But I don't have a feeling that art world is capable to compete effectively. I am absolutely sure that art world in general loses struggle. So I don't believe that art world is powerful enough in the context of our culture for this competition for the masses of spectators, yeah, for creating strong images. And then if you look at the exhibition practice, contemporary exhibition practice, maybe I have more in mind European ones than American one because it's not so commercialized. But what's interesting about it is that you have less and less focus in all the museums and Kunsthallen all around the world on the permanent collection, because permanent collection actually was supposed to consist of masterpieces, of very strong images that would capture the eye of the audience, of the democratic audience. Louvre still has some kind of remnants of that, maybe other museums. But in general, museum more and more becomes a place for the temporal exhibitions. And the temporal exhibition is, by definition, being temporal, it is weak. Yeah, every exhibition is weak. Every exhibition is weak because from the beginning you know that this exhibition disappears in a very short time. And even if it is fixed by media coverage, even if you have a catalog and so on, exhibition per se is not a permanent phenomenon. So the true belief in the power of art was manifested traditionally in a permanent collection. And the decrease of the relevance of the permanent collections is actually a very accurate reflection of deep skepsis in relationship to the art world as produces strong images. So what I try to show is that art world being not anymore producer of strong images actually found a different way to function on a different level of social practice and also on different level of social acceptance. Because the same people who do not accept traditional art, avant-garde art and contemporary art as valuable using the same practices as contemporary art in their own lifestyle, in their own self-presentation. You know, it's really a kind of proverbial thing, but I was confronted with that recently. It's really happened, like 3 weeks ago. Somebody told me the classical phrase, "My child can do the same thing as Malevich." Yeah? And so, why should I admire Malevich? And my immediate answer was, of course, you should not admire Malevich. You should admire your child. It's very strange that if the people say that Malevich can do things like the child, they think Malevich is bad or is not good enough. They never think that the child is a genius. Yeah? So, and that is precisely the right way to think that. The capability of a child to do that and be recognized as a genius was opened by Malevich. So people are not use that, and if they use that, then they actually at the beginning start to use that way of looking at their own art production and production of the children, then they actually use also avant-garde tradition the right way.
I wanted to ask you, you showed us an example of an artist that operates a reduction. And if do you believe that today there are some artists that do not operate this reduction at all?
Yeah, I think there's two different questions. One question is, if there are some artists that do not operate, I would say yes. If they say at all, I would say that's always a problem, yeah, how you can speak about that. But I think yes. I think that to make a reduction under the condition of democratically accessible space of exhibition, this reduction should be seen as really functioning reduction. So it should not be a reduction. It should also look as a reduction. Yeah, that is modern. Yeah, that's what's the difference between modernity and classical Platonic. You know, looking to the essence of the things. Yeah, you can look at the essence of the things, and the things are the same, but you can reduce them in your imagination, only through a philosophical reflection. But under the condition of contemporary art, things not only have to be reduced, they have to look reduced. As an example, as an interesting example of this reduction, I already used the example of Andy Warhol, but in general, just to give you some idea of what I think about, yeah, when I speak about contemporary reductions, is that what happened to the music, to movies, to poetry, and to many other human activities at the moment as they become something like time-based art. What actually happens is that movies moved to the art space. Movies that were not so successful in the framework of commercial cinema circles and so on and so on, cinema theaters, they massively go to the exhibition spaces. A lot of people speaking about crisis of the museum, but in fact, museum is occupied by filmmakers. So why they do that? Because they turn the strong images into the weak images. The image, cinematic image is strong if you see it from the beginning to the end, if you see the film from the beginning to the end and let be influenced by that. If you put the same movie in loop in the exhibition space, you visit this exhibition space maybe for 5 or 10 minutes and then go back. Then the same image that is very strong in the cinematic context suddenly becomes to be very weak in artistic context. And this weakness is not something that people want to escape. This weakness is something that they want to become, that they want to acquire. And they more and more produce also weak cinematic images. For example, image of the road that takes like 30 hours and 100 hours. Yeah. It is extremely weak image, but by being weak image and shown under the condition of the low visibility, it suddenly becomes a very effective means of reduction. I also visited, for example, what was very much influenced me, also a very interesting event in Paris. It was, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. It was a space of the installation of reading À la recherche du temps perdu of Marcel Proust. Weeks and weeks and weeks long, 24 hours a day, so without interruptions for the night. Parisian actors were reading Proust in loop. So at the moment that they ended, they began again. So you could visit Proust instead of read it. Yeah? And this kind of revisiting Proustian text is, of course, a creation of the weak visibility of the text. At the same time, the text of Proust is very well, of course, is written in a kind of weak way, yeah, that fits very well this kind of installation. Same can be said about sound installation and so on and so on. So my favorite examples of this strategy that I could not present all of them here, Francis Alice is part of it, are related to time-based art and its presentation in a weak form. I think it's a very effective and very radical way of reduction in the context of contemporary art. I couldn't develop that.
I was wondering if weak was a right word to speak about what you describe as contemporary art practices, because at some point when you keep on using that word of weak images and reductive artistic practices, it really damaged at some point the political dimension of art and the political dimension of artists in the society. So it has a kind of like second side effect that I think is not necessarily what you're looking for. And on the other hand, the images that you consider as weak, maybe they are weak in their seductive aspect. When you compare them to like pop images, in fact, it's true, they're not like sexy, flashy, like speed dating feeling, but maybe they are just smart images and it's more like an intelligent something that you should be looking for rather than use weak, because at somehow it damaged a lot. I mean, there is a twist there that is like.
I know, but I do that on purpose, of course. Yeah, I do that on purpose in a polemical way. Yeah? On purpose, because it sounds not good. Yeah? So that's why I use. So to speak about weak images is weak in itself. Yeah? If you speak about, for example, zero science, yeah, it's fashionable, yeah, because zero science, floating science, is kind of fashionable. Strong images are also fashionable. But if you speak about weak images, it sounds weak. Yeah? And that's precisely what I want to do. Now, why I did want to do that? why I did want to, not to only to speak about weak images, but to make a weak speech. because there are different strategies. There shouldn't be, there are different strategies. Yeah, one strategy is not better than another. But there are different strategies of dealing, as I said, with status quo, with political protest and general politics about, and art in the context of politics, One is a kind of a revolutionary struggle. And if you organize something like a revolutionary struggle, then you have to be stronger than your opponent. Yeah, because if you want to empower yourselves, you should be even stronger. And then the opponent becomes to be even stronger, and you become to be even stronger, everybody becomes to be even stronger. And as also Walter Benjamin has shown, what happens is that the strength itself begins to be reproduced through your own gesture. That means that after you became so strong that you can win the battle against your enemies, you become to be like your enemies because you reproduce this strength. What is not per se bad? Yeah? I mean, I don't say that is bad. We have good examples of that. Yeah? We have bad examples of that, or every example is bad and good at the same time. But you know, there are different strategies. One of them is what I try to describe in my weak speech, and that is just strategy of abandoning certain kind of societal constellations. You know, it's like people of Maya at a certain time abandoned the pyramids and the cities collapsed. They never were really taken by any enemy power. They just was not kept in you know, a proper form by the population. The population just was not anymore interested, yeah, in them. And it seems to me that more and more in our time, that was also the case actually with the Soviet Union and many other, that certain system collapsed simply because population was not interested in keeping them. There was no revolt, there was no revolution, there was nothing. It was just kind of apathic letting them think and letting them collapse. That is a weak strategy, but it's a very effective strategy, in fact. And I almost have a feeling that it what happens now with this, you know, mastodons, or I don't know, dinosaurs of the mass culture of the 20th century. If you look at people going to these movies, look at that, mostly teenager, yeah, so more and more, people just go away from it. They don't struggle against it. That was the case in 20th century. They are not any more hysterical about them as De Boer was, yeah, or desperate. Yeah. They just go away and open their own website about their own cat. Yeah? And somehow all along, at the moment that this movement of going away and not taking that seriously, not participating in that, not being excited about that, yeah, this practice actually, I'm sure, let this system collapse in some time. It takes some time. But I'm sure after some time, it doesn't be recognizable anymore. It doesn't be like now. Yeah. And this kind of non-participation or doing something else is a certain kind of strategy of resistance that seems to be not very sexy maybe at the first gaze, at the first glance, but it's quite effective, yeah, if you look at that historically.
you know, in Iran, for instance, I mean, it's not battling against the monster of like capitalistic entertainment industries, but there is a very strong underground art scene and music scene and film. So it's like what you would call like weak artistic practices, but they do actually have a very strong political impact. I mean, they're in the Islamic regime, all that community of artists, they go to jail. I mean, it's radically illegal. So in that case, it's like, it's not the same kind of confrontation, but it's a reality that is kind of interesting. Yeah.
I think it's reality, and I know the people, some of them, yeah, and also exhibited some artists from my exhibition from Tehran, so I know a bit of the situation. And it is really like everywhere in the sense that you described. That, of course, situation is different because there's kind of repression that you don't have in democratic societies, and still, it seems to me that also under the kind of liberal system and so on and so on, maybe it's not so spectacular as in Tehran, yeah, because speaking about Tehran, we also have some strong spectacular images in our memory, yeah, that were transmitted to us by TV. And they kind of overpowering, yeah, what is actually artists actually doing. They are not very happy about that, actually. They are very, very ambiguous about this effect, if you speak to them. So what happens actually is that also in the West, yeah, you have this kind of movements, kind of sea changes. Yeah, I don't believe that that any system can function if it is supported half-heartedly. It's enough for it to collapse. And that's what happens increasingly, it seems to me, yeah? In certain aspects not. So that is why weak. Yeah? Weak because not zero. What I hate is this kind of rhetoric of zero signs and floating signifiers. Not because I hate it psychologically, but I think it's really kind of, and I don't want to be strong. So I want to be a bit polemical.
I have a question connected to the zero discussion.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if the act of reduction is a curve constantly decreasing, if it doesn't hit zero, what happens when it hits the low point? Does it start crawling up, or does it rise dramatically, or what happens then? How long can we reduce if we are already imitating something that's already a reduction?
Oh yes, I think it will go on forever, yeah, because I think it will go forever as long as people do want to do that. It would be always possible because you cannot reduce to zero. You cannot reduce radically once for all time, because if it would be possible, then Duchamp and Malevich would already do that, yeah, already have done that, because as I said, these images that you create as weak images, they can become strong images. For example, in the art history, everybody thinks that Malevich was grandiose also, yeah, and incredibly powerful artist, created like icons of modernity inside the art world. Outside the art world, they think that he was completely irrelevant, just an idiot. Yeah, so you have these two opposite attitudes. Both of them do not recognize his images for what they actually are, and so this confusion and misrecognition and misunderstanding is produced by the same gesture, by the same move as you produce clarification and reduction. By the same move as you produced reduction, you produce also strong images of reduction. By producing strong images of reduction, you produce new strong images that should be reduced again. That is like with Marxism. Yeah, you have to apply Marxism on Marxism all the time. If you don't do that, then you get actually the same situation that you try to change. Okay, I think no more questions, yeah?